The auctioneer's gavel hadn't even finished its first swing when Maris Rowan's father snatched her wrist and dragged her onto the wooden platform like she was a piece of furniture he'd grown tired of. 17 years I fed this girl, Thomas Rowan announced to the crowd, his voice carrying no shame whatsoever. Somebody better make it worth my trouble. The laughter that followed wasn't the kind that fades quickly. It settled into the square like dust after a stampede, heavy, choking, permanent. Nobody looked away. Nobody spoke up. And Maris stood there in the blazing red hollow sun, her worn dress still damp from morning chores, staring at the faces of people she'd known her entire life while they debated her price like she was a broken plow. If that had been you standing on that platform, would anyone have stepped forward? Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that makes your blood boil and your heart ache at the same time, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Stories like Maris's are exactly why we're here. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Red Hollow, because what happened next changed everything. The morning had started the way most mornings did in Red Hollow, with Maris doing work that nobody noticed and nobody thanked her for. She'd been up before the rooster made a sound, hauling water from the creek because the well rope had snapped again and her father hadn't fixed it in 3 months. She'd fed the 2 remaining chickens, swept the porch, and started a fire from wood she'd split herself the evening before. By the time Thomas Rowan stumbled out of the house squinting against the light, Maris already had cornmeal heating over the flames and a pot of weak coffee that smelled better than it tasted. Her father sat down without a word of greeting. He ate without looking at her. When he finished, he wiped his mouth on his sleeve and said, "Get your good dress on. We're going to town." Maris didn't ask why. She'd learned not to ask why. Asking why with Thomas Rowan usually meant a longer explanation than you wanted and a worse outcome than you feared. She changed into the only dress she owned that didn't have a visible patch on it, a faded blue thing that had once belonged to her mother, taken in twice at the waist and let out once at the hem, because Maris had grown 3 inches the summer after her mother died and nobody had thought to buy her anything new. She pinned her hair back. She washed her face in the basin. She did these things not because anyone would notice, but because her mother had always said that keeping yourself decent had nothing to do with impressing others and everything to do with not losing yourself entirely. That was the last piece of her mother's advice that still held. The walk to town was 20 minutes on a good road. Thomas Rowan walked it in silence, which should have warned her. He was never silent unless he was either drunk or planning something. He didn't smell like whiskey that morning, which left only one possibility. Red Hollow, on a market day, was as loud as it ever got. Wagons crowding the main road, men shouting prices over fence rails, women comparing cloth at the dry goods counter, children weaving between legs and getting cuffed for it. The noise usually comforted Maris in a strange way. It meant people were busy. When people were busy, they didn't have time to look at her and say the things they usually said. But her father didn't stop at the market stalls. He walked straight to the center square, where a makeshift platform had been erected near the water trough. Just a few boards nailed together on sawhorses, barely knee-high, but elevated enough that whoever stood on it could be seen by everyone in the square. Maris saw Clement Hicks standing up there already, the man who called himself an auctioneer, though he'd never done anything more formal than sell off farm equipment after foreclosures. He had a face like old leather and a voice that carried 3 blocks without effort. "What's this?" Maris asked, and she hated herself immediately for how small the question came out. Her father grabbed her wrist. Not a gentle grip, not the grip of a man leading his daughter somewhere. The grip of a man who'd already decided something and didn't want any resistance complicating it. "Papa, hush!" He pulled her forward through the crowd, and the people parted. They always parted for Thomas Rowan because he was the kind of man who walked like he was owed space. The fact that he was broke and behind on every debt in the county didn't dim the entitlement one bit. Some men carried poverty like a wound. Thomas Rowan carried it like everyone else's fault. The crowd was already gathering. Market day always drew people, and a platform in the center square drew more. Maris noticed faces she recognized. The Dunfield brothers who ran the grain mill, Mrs. Pierce, who taught Sunday school, the Reardon boys who'd thrown mud at Maris's dress when she was 12 and never apologized, Sheriff Alton standing at the edge with his thumbs hooked in his belt like he was watching something he'd already decided wasn't his concern. Thomas Rowan walked her right up to the platform and pushed her onto it. Not a guide, a push. Her boot caught the edge and she stumbled, catching herself with both hands on the boards. She heard the first laugh before she'd even straightened up, a short bark from the back of the crowd, the kind that gives other people permission to follow. They followed. 17 years I fed this girl. Her father's voice rose above the noise, and Maris understood then, with a clarity so sharp it was almost physical, exactly what was happening. 17 years, and what have I got for it? A woman nobody'll marry and a farm that's drowning in debt. Somebody here better make it worth my trouble. Maris stood on that platform and looked at the crowd and thought, with the eerie calm of a person in shock, nobody is going to stop this. Not because they couldn't, because they wouldn't. Clement Hicks climbed up beside her with an energy that suggested he found this more interesting than a hay wagon. He gripped her arm with the same casual authority he probably used on livestock. "What do we have here?" he said, less a question than a performance. He walked a slow half-circle around her, and Maris kept her eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd, the way her mother had told her to look when something humiliating happened. Find something above their heads and stare at it. Don't give them your eyes. Your eyes are yours. "Strong back," Clement Hicks announced. "Decent teeth. Cooks and cleans, so Thomas tells me. She's a little plain, boys, but plain things work harder. Who'll start me at $20? Silence. Then someone in the back shouted, 10, and the laughter started again, and Maris felt the boards beneath her feet and thought about how her mother's dress was going to get dirty on this filthy platform, and somehow that thought was the one that nearly broke her when everything else hadn't. The bidding went badly, which was almost funny in a terrible way. $5. 3. Someone shouted $2.50 as a joke, and his friend doubled over laughing. Clement Hicks worked the crowd with practiced theatrics, but the truth was plain. Nobody in Red Hollow wanted Maris Rowan badly enough to spend real money, and they were willing to say so out loud while she stood right there listening. Mrs. Pierce, who had once given Maris a biscuit after church and called her a sweet child, looked at her shoes. The Dunfield brothers were grinning. Sheriff Alton had turned to say something to his deputy, entirely uninterested, and Thomas Rowan stood at the base of the platform with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the expression of a man trying to get fair market value for a tool that kept disappointing him. Maris had known all her life that her father didn't love her the way fathers were supposed to love daughters. She'd made her peace with it in the small, private way you make peace with things you can't change, quietly, in the dark, and never completely. But she had believed, in the way you believe things you need to believe just to keep getting up in the morning, that he would not do something like this. Standing on that platform, she understood she had been wrong about that too. The bidding had stalled somewhere around $4 when the crowd shifted. Not dramatically, not with shouting or commotion. The crowd just shifted, the way water shifts when something large moves beneath it. People at the back stepped sideways. A murmur moved through the square in a wave, passing from the rear to the front, reaching Maris on her platform as a change in the quality of the air. She looked up from her fixed point above the crowd's heads. A man on horseback had stopped at the edge of the square. He hadn't announced himself. He hadn't called out. He'd simply arrived, and something about the way he sat on that horse, absolutely still, reading the scene with dark, unhurried eyes, had caught people's attention the way still things sometimes catch attention better than moving ones. He was not a young man, not old either. Somewhere in the middle distance of his 40s, built the way men get when their work is physical and never stops. His face was weathered in a way that suggested not just sun, but something harder, something that had pressed down on him for years and left marks. He had a beard that needed attention and a coat that had seen better decades. He looked at the platform. He looked at Maris. He looked at Thomas Rowan. He looked at Clement Hicks. Then he said, in a voice that was not loud but carried anyway, "Has anyone asked what she wants?" The square went quiet. Not gradually. All at once, like a candle being covered. Clement Hicks blinked. "I beg your pardon?" The woman up there. The man on horseback hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice. Has anyone asked her what she wants? Thomas Rowan's face went through several colors. Now, just a minute. I'm not talking to you. The man finally dismounted, slowly, with the careful movements of someone whose knees had an old argument with stairs and ladders. He handed his reins to nobody in particular, just held them out, and a young boy nearby took them without being asked, apparently too surprised to do otherwise. The man walked forward through the crowd, and the crowd let him through the same way it had let Thomas Rowan through, except for a different reason. Thomas Rowan parted crowds by walking like he owned them. This man parted crowds by walking like he had nowhere particular to be and no patience for obstacles. He stopped at the base of the platform. He looked up at Maris. She looked down at him. "Well?" he said. It took her a moment to understand he was actually asking, that the question was real, directed at her, waiting for an answer. "What do I want?" she repeated, and her voice came out rougher than she intended because she'd been holding herself very still for the past several minutes, trying not to shake. "That's what I asked." Maris looked at the crowd around her. She looked at her father. She looked at the auctioneer with his hand still half raised from a bid nobody had matched. "I want to leave," she said. "I never want to see this town again." The man nodded like that was a reasonable answer. He reached into his coat, produced a worn leather wallet, and counted bills into his palm with a deliberateness that was almost insulting in its calm. "What's the current bid?" he asked Clement Hicks. Hicks, visibly flustered, said, $4 and, well, it was $4.50 at the last. "I'll pay what her father asked at the start." He held the money out to Thomas Rowan, not to Clement. $20. Not to own her. To settle whatever debt he thinks she owes him for the crime of being his daughter. Thomas Rowan stared at the money. His jaw worked. "Take it or leave it," the man said. "But if you leave it, I'll be asking the sheriff some questions about the legality of what's happening in this square, and I suspect that conversation gets complicated for you." Thomas Rowan took the money. The man turned back to Maris. He didn't offer her a hand down from the platform. He didn't presume to touch her. He just stepped back and said, "You said you wanted to leave. There's your chance. I've got a ranch 12 miles up in the foothills. I need someone who can manage accounts. I pay fair wages. You can come if you want, or you can walk in any other direction you choose. Either way, that money means nobody here has a claim on you anymore." He turned and walked back toward his horse. Maris stood on the platform for a moment longer than made sense, long enough for the crowd to start murmuring again, long enough for her father to start backing away with his $20 like he was afraid someone might take it back, long enough for Clement Hicks to climb down from the platform, looking vaguely disappointed that the entertainment had ended so strangely. She stepped down from the platform. Her boot hit the dirt, and she felt the ground beneath her foot differently than she ever had before. Like it was ground she was choosing to stand on instead of ground she'd been placed on. She picked up her skirt and walked after the man with the worn coat. He heard her behind him and paused at his horse without turning around. He said, "My name's Gideon Hale. Maris Rowan." "I know." He turned then and looked at her properly, and up close his eyes were darker than she'd thought, not unkind, but careful. The eyes of someone who'd learned to look before trusting. "I've been coming to Red Hollow for supplies twice a year for 11 years. People talk." "What did they say about me?" He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up. He looked down at her for a moment, something passing across his face that she couldn't read. "Nothing worth repeating," he said, "which ought to tell you something about the people who said it." She walked to get her horse, she didn't have a horse, and then stopped, because she had nothing. No horse, no bag, nothing she'd brought from the house because she hadn't known she was leaving. She had the dress on her back and the pins in her hair and the 3 cents in her pocket she'd found under the porch 2 weeks ago and kept for no reason she could name. Gideon Hale looked down at her standing in the middle of the road with no plan and no possessions, and said, without any particular judgment, "You can ride behind if you don't mind the pace." She minded nothing. She swung up behind him on the horse, settled her hands awkwardly at her sides because she didn't know where to hold, and then the horse moved and she grabbed the back of his coat because she had no choice. He didn't comment on it. They rode out of Red Hollow as the market day continued behind them, the crowd already moving on to other business, her father already counting his $20 a second time. The platform already being disassembled for lumber. Nobody watched them go. Nobody called out. Nobody said good luck or Godspeed or what a shame or any of the things people say at departures. Maris kept her eyes forward and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she barely recognized it. Space, just space. Air in her lungs that didn't taste like someone else's judgment. Sky ahead of her instead of the same four walls and the same three faces and the same endless days of work that earned her nothing except the right to keep doing it tomorrow. She was shaking, she realized. Her hands on the back of Gideon Hale's coat were shaking. She couldn't tell if it was terror or relief. Maybe they felt the same when you'd never had either. The road climbed out of the valley, and Red Hollow dropped below and behind them. And Maris Rowan, who had been auctioned that morning like a broken plow, rode toward a mountain she'd never seen and a stranger she didn't know, toward a future that contained nothing guaranteed and nothing familiar. She didn't look back. Not once. And the man in front of her, who had asked one question that nobody else had thought to ask, who had paid $20 not to own her but to free her, who had not offered a hand she hadn't requested or promised anything he might not be able to deliver. That man rode in silence the entire 12 miles. He didn't try to explain himself. He didn't offer reassurances. He didn't fill the silence with words designed to make her comfortable, because some silences don't need filling. Some silences are the first real breath a person has taken in years. He understood that. Somehow. She didn't know how yet. But she would. The ranch didn't look like salvation. That was the first thing Maris noticed when they crested the last ridge, and the foothills opened up into a wide, ragged spread of land that had clearly been fighting with the mountain for years and wasn't entirely winning. The main house was solid enough. 2 stories of weathered timber with a porch that leaned slightly to the left, like a man tired from long work. The barn needed paint. One of the fence lines along the eastern pasture had a section that had given up entirely and was lying flat in the grass, the posts rotted through at the base. A chicken coop stood near the house with a patched roof that suggested someone had fixed it recently, but in a hurry. A woodpile stacked against the side of the house was the one thing that looked genuinely tended, split clean, stacked tight, covered with oilcloth. Gideon Hale dismounted at the gate and didn't apologize for any of it. That, Maris would think later, was when she first started to trust him. Not much, but a thread of it. A man who apologizes for what he has before you've even seen it is a man managing your expectations because he's already planning to disappoint you. Gideon just tied the horse and opened the gate and waited for her to come through, and the silence said, "This is what there is. You can decide what to do with that." She came through the gate. The inside of the house was cleaner than the outside suggested, which surprised her. Not neat in any careful way. There were stacks of papers on the table and a coat hung over the back of the only armchair and a pair of boots that had been left by the door and then apparently kicked sideways and never straightened. But it wasn't filthy, and it didn't smell of neglect. It smelled of sawdust and coffee, and something she couldn't identify that she would later realize was just the particular smell of a house occupied by one person who spent most of their time outdoors. "Kitchen's through there," Gideon said. "Pantry beside it. Your room is upstairs, second door." She looked at the stairs. She looked at him. "My room," she repeated. "You can look at it before you decide anything. If it doesn't suit, I'll sleep in the barn and you can have the whole upstairs." He said it flatly, without the edge of someone offering a grand gesture, like it was just logistics. She went upstairs. The room was small and had one window that faced east, which meant morning light. The bed had a quilt that was old but whole. There was a chest of drawers with a cracked mirror on top, and a wooden chair in the corner. And on the door, on the inside of the door, there was a bolt. Heavy iron, recently oiled. She could tell it was recent because the wood around the screws was still pale, still new-looking, the finish not yet darkened by air and time. Someone had installed that bolt recently. Someone had thought about it in advance. She stood at that door for a long moment, her hand on the bolt, sliding it back and forth once. The sound it made was solid and certain. She came back downstairs and Gideon was in the kitchen pouring coffee into 2 cups, like it was something they did every evening. "You put that bolt on the door," she said. He set the coffee pot down. "Yes." "When?" 3 days ago." She pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. Her legs were tired from the ride, and her hands had finally stopped shaking, but there was a new trembling somewhere in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the specific, disorienting shock of being treated like someone whose comfort had been considered before she even arrived. "You knew you were coming to Red Hollow for me specifically," she said. It wasn't entirely a question. Gideon sat across from her and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her with those careful dark eyes. "I knew Thomas Rowan had been telling people for 2 months he was planning to settle his debts however he could. I knew what that meant. I'd heard about you over the years. Heard enough." He paused. "I almost didn't come. It's not my business what people do in their own town. But you came." "I came." He looked at his coffee. "I told myself I was just going for supplies." The honesty of that, the admission that he'd almost talked himself out of it, that he wasn't a hero who'd ridden in with a plan, that landed differently than a polished story would have. "What do you actually need?" she asked. "The accounts work." "What does that mean exactly?" "I have 3 years of receipts in a box in the front room that I haven't organized because I don't have the patience for it. I have a ledger that I've been filling out myself, and I'm probably doing it wrong. I have freight contracts I don't understand half of, and land agreements that need renewing, and I can't keep track of what I owe versus what I'm owed." He looked up. "I'm good with animals and timber and fixing things that break. I'm terrible with paper." "What are you paying?" He named a figure. It was fair. It was actually more than fair for a ranch position, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed that directly. "I'll look at the ledger in the morning," Maris said. He nodded. That was all. No gratitude speech, no expectations laid out, no rules announced. He finished his coffee and said there was bread in the pantry and cold beans from the afternoon if she was hungry, and then he went out to see to the horse, and Maris sat alone in the kitchen of a stranger's house in the mountains 12 miles from the town that had sold her that morning, and ate cold beans standing up at the counter because she was hungry, and she didn't see any reason to pretend otherwise. The first week was careful on both sides. Gideon left before sunrise every morning and came back at midday covered in whatever the morning's work had produced: mud, sawdust, animal smell, once a long cut along his forearm from a fence wire that he wrapped himself in the barn and didn't mention until she noticed it at supper and asked. He cooked his own meals without expecting her to take that over, which surprised her. She started cooking anyway because the alternative was 2 people making separate food in the same small kitchen, and that was more awkward than just making enough for 2. He always said it was good. She knew some of it wasn't. The first biscuit she made in his oven came out flat because she hadn't accounted for the altitude, and she knew it the moment she pulled them out. She put them on the table without comment. He ate them without comment. Some negotiations happened entirely in silence. She found the ledger on the second morning, sitting in a battered tin box on the shelf beside the front room window. She took it to the kitchen table and opened it, and spent the first 20 minutes just understanding Gideon's system, which was not quite a system, but more of an intention toward one. Dates and amounts recorded in a handwriting that was large and slightly uneven, like a man who'd learned to write later than most and had done it seriously. She found the first problem on the 3rd page. It was small, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. A freight charge recorded as paid that, when she cross-referenced against the receipts in the box, had actually been paid twice, once in March and once in April, both times to the same carrier, Crow Mountain Freight, for what appeared to be the same load of timber supplies. She set that receipt aside and kept reading. By the end of the first morning, she had a small pile of similar anomalies. She didn't say anything yet. She needed more. By the end of the first week, she had a larger pile and a cold feeling settling in her stomach that she recognized from the times in her childhood when she'd understood something bad before she could fully explain it. She spread everything out on the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when Gideon came in early from the fence work. He looked at the papers covering every surface and went still in the doorway. "Sit down," Maris said. He sat. "How long have you been using Crow Mountain Freight?" 6, 7 years. They're the only carrier that runs this far into the foothills regularly. Has the rate ever changed? He thought about it. Gone up some. Silas Crow always said it was fuel costs, road maintenance. What do you know about Silas Crow? Gideon's expression shifted. Not quite suspicion, but the look of a man who'd just felt the first cold air before a storm. Runs freight and a few land operations down in the valley. Big operation. Has his hands in a lot of things. Maris put her finger on the first duplicated receipt, then the second, then the third. She walked him through 7 instances over 3 years where he'd been charged twice for the same service, the duplicate always arriving 6 to 8 weeks after the original and described in slightly different language so it didn't obviously match. Gideon looked at the receipts. His jaw tightened slowly. "That's my money," he said. "That's your money." She moved to a different stack. "That's not the part that worries me most." She showed him the freight rate record she'd charted by hand on a sheet of paper. A simple grid of dates and charges. The rates had increased 19 times in 3 years. Not dramatically each time. Incrementally. Almost invisibly, month by month, in amounts small enough that a busy man managing a mountain ranch alone might never notice the cumulative damage. But she'd noticed. She'd charted it. And the line it made wasn't random variation in operating costs. It was deliberate. "Someone's been running these rates up on purpose," she said, "slowly enough that you wouldn't see it in any single month. But over 3 years," she put the total at the bottom of the chart, "you've paid almost $400 more than the contracted rate allows." Gideon looked at the number for a long time. "I have a contract with Crow," he said. "I know, I found it." She pulled it from the bottom of the pile. The contract specifies maximum rate increases of 3% annually, subject to written notice. I count 19 increases, most of them given no notice at all, and the total adds up to something close to 30% over the contracted base rate. She watched him understand it, watched his face go through the stages. Confusion, comprehension, the particular cold anger of a man who realizes he's been robbed slowly enough that he helped it happen by not looking. "Why would Crow bother," he said, "with one ranch up in the hills?" Maris looked at him steadily. "I don't think it's just one ranch." She told him what she'd started to suspect but couldn't yet prove, that if Crow's freight operation was doing this to Gideon, it was likely doing it to every isolated farm and ranch in the foothills, places too remote to compare notes, too dependent on the single available carrier to refuse service, too busy surviving to track the slow bleed in their accounts. And if Crow was running the freight rates, she said, he was also in a position to know exactly which properties were struggling, which farms were underwater, which ranches might be forced to sell if the financial pressure got bad enough. He's not just overcharging, she said. He's creating the conditions for foreclosure, and then he buys. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines, a sound like something breathing. Gideon sat with his hands flat on the table, not moving, looking at the papers in front of him, and Maris watched him come to the same conclusion she'd arrived at alone that morning and hadn't wanted to believe. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. 14 years? "Who owns the land around you?" "Used to be 4 or 5 independent farms. Dalton to the south. Mercer had the eastern pasture. Old widow named Havers had 100 acres at the base of the ridge." He stopped. "All of them sold in the last 4 years. I thought it was just times being hard." "Who bought?" He looked at her. "Crow Holdings," she said quietly. "I found the name in 2 of your freight invoices as a forwarding address for billing disputes. I looked at your land documentation this morning. Your ranch sits between 3 parcels now all owned by Crow Holdings, and your road access runs through an easement over the Dalton land, which Crow bought 18 months ago." Gideon stood up slowly. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the pines. "He can close my road," he said, "if he chooses to. And if he does, you can't move freight. You can't get supplies. You can't operate." She paused. "I think that's what comes next. I think he runs the rates up until the money runs out, then he closes the road access. Then he makes an offer on the land at a fraction of its value and calls it charity." When Gideon turned around, his face was controlled in a way that suggested the control was taking effort. "You figured all of this out in a week," he said. "I've been around men like Crow my whole life," Maris said, and the flatness in her voice came from a place too deep and too tired to be anger. "They just usually work on a smaller scale." There was a silence between them that was different from the careful silences of the first week. Not the silence of two people being polite, but the silence of two people standing at the edge of something larger than either of them had expected. "What do I do?" Gideon asked. She didn't expect that question. She expected him to start planning on his own, to take the information and go, to do what men in her experience did when women handed them useful things, absorb it and proceed without acknowledgement. The directness of the question, the fact that it was genuinely directed at her, caught her off guard in a way that she covered by looking back at the papers. "You don't do anything yet," she said. "Not until we know more. If Crow figures out that someone's been looking at his billing patterns, he'll move faster. We need everything documented and copied before we make any move." "How long will that take?" "Weeks, maybe longer." She looked up at him. "And we need to find out if other properties in the valley are seeing the same pattern. Because if it's just you, it's a billing dispute. If it's 20 farms, it's fraud." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said we." She hadn't noticed she'd said it. "I meant," she started. "I know what you meant." He wasn't making it a moment. He was just noting it the way he noted most things, directly, without ornamentation. He sat back down at the table and looked at the papers. "Tell me what you need." Over the next 2 weeks, Maris built a system. She organized the receipt box chronologically first, then by vendor, then by cross-reference with the ledger entries. She created a second ledger, her own, with her own notations, that tracked every Crow freight charge against the original contract terms. The discrepancies she found weren't all the same type. Some were duplicate charges. Some were rate overruns. Some were more subtle, loads listed at heavier weights than the contracts described, generating higher charges for shipments that hadn't actually been larger. The weight fraud was the one that made her stop and sit still for a full 10 minutes when she found it, because it meant Crow didn't just have a crooked billing department. It meant someone was falsifying shipping manifests. It meant the fraud went beyond overcharging. It meant documentation was being deliberately altered, which was a different category of crime entirely. She was staring at the fourth falsified manifest when she heard Gideon come in from the barn. She didn't turn around. "He's forging documents," she said. A long pause behind her, then the scrape of the other chair. "Show me." She showed him. The manifest listed timber loads at weights 10 to 15% higher than the loads that had actually been delivered. She could tell because Gideon had kept his own rough tallies in a notebook he used for tracking inventory, and while his notes weren't formal accounting, they were specific enough to show a consistent and significant gap between what Crow's papers claimed had been delivered and what had actually arrived. Gideon looked at his own notebook, looked at the manifest, looked at his notebook again. "I wrote these down at the time," he said. "I remember being surprised when the bills were higher than I expected, but Crow's office said it was the weight scale in Hartson they used, said it was calibrated different from mine." "Did you verify that?" "I was alone running a ranch. I had 400 other things to do." He set the notebook down. The anger in his voice now wasn't sharp. It was low, the kind that settles in and stays. "How long has he been doing this?" "Based on what I can find here, at least 5 years. Possibly longer." She looked at him carefully. "Gideon, how much debt do you have?" He was quiet for a moment. "More than I should." "How close are you to—" "Close enough." He pushed back from the table. "That's not your concern." She didn't argue, but it was her concern whether he wanted it to be or not, because in the 2 weeks she'd been sitting at his kitchen table, she'd built a picture of this ranch's finances that was clearer than Gideon apparently had ever let himself see all at once, and the picture was not comfortable. The land was his. The timber was solid. The cattle he ran were small in number but healthy. The actual operating costs, stripped of Crow's inflation, were manageable. But layered on top of the legitimate costs was years of systematically extracted money, and the debt that had resulted from that slow bleeding had been building interest quietly this whole time. He wasn't about to lose the ranch tomorrow, but he was closer than he knew. She thought about telling him all of this and then thought about the way he'd said, "That's not your concern." Not as a dismissal exactly, but as the particular kind of wall a person builds around the things they're most afraid to look at, and decided to let it sit for one more day. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark with the bolt drawn and the east window letting in a thin slice of mountain sky. And she thought about Silas Crow, whose name she'd heard once or twice in Red Hollow, over the years attached to vague references to land deals and freight contracts, and the occasional remark about how he'd built himself quite an operation. She thought about the other farms, Dalton, Mercer, the widow Havers, all sold, all gone, all bought by a man whose freight operation had likely been bleeding them dry for years before the moment they'd finally given up. She thought about how a fraud like this worked, not dramatically, not like the stories people told about bandits and robbery, but quietly, patiently, over years, in numbers too small to seem worth fighting on any given day until the accumulation finally swallowed you whole. She thought about how nobody had noticed, or maybe they had noticed, some of them, in pieces, and hadn't known what they were looking at, or hadn't known how to look at all of it together, or had been too isolated up in their foothills to compare their experience with anyone else's. What she had was pieces. What she needed was the whole picture, and the only way to get the whole picture was to find the other farms. Talk to the people who'd sold, get their records if any existed, their memories if records didn't, which meant going back to the valley. She wasn't ready to think about that yet. She thought instead about Gideon, which was less comfortable in a different way. She'd been watching him for 2 weeks with the particular attention she gave to things she didn't yet understand, and what she'd seen didn't match what she'd expected. He didn't give orders. He made suggestions, and when she did things differently than he'd suggested, he watched to see if her way worked and adjusted his own approach if it did. When something went wrong, a fence section that came down again in a wind, the chicken coop roof that leaked despite the recent patch, he didn't look for anyone to blame. He just fixed it, methodically, without drama. He'd grown up in forced labor. She didn't know the details. He hadn't told her and she hadn't asked, though it explained things. The way he moved through work with a quality of endurance rather than enthusiasm. The way he ate whatever was in front of him without comment. The way a man eats when he's spent years not knowing if there would be more. The way he treated the bolt on her door like a basic reasonable thing because he knew what it was like to have a door without one. He was not an easy man. He was closed in places she suspected ran very deep, and there were moments when something crossed his face that she recognized as old pain wearing the expression of ordinary tiredness. He had tempers he didn't fully show. She could see them in the way his hands went still sometimes when he was angry, the deliberate stillness of a man who'd learned that stillness was safer than movement. But he was decent, not in a showy way, in the way of a person who'd decided a long time ago, probably in circumstances that made decency difficult, that it was the only way he was willing to be. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected any of this, if she was honest. She'd followed him off that platform in Red Hollow because there was nowhere else to go and any direction was better than staying. She'd expected to discover the hidden conditions, the real reason he'd bought her out of that square, the thing he'd want in return. 3 weeks in, she was still waiting for the thing he'd want in return. She was beginning to suspect there wasn't one, which was, in its own way, harder to accept than any bad motive would have been. Bad motives, she understood. She'd been surrounded by them her entire life, and she knew how to navigate them. Simple decency, offered without expectation, was something she had no map for. One evening, 10 days after she'd found the forged manifests, she was working late at the kitchen table when she heard the sound that turned out to be Gideon coming downstairs before she realized he usually didn't come downstairs after supper. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway in his work clothes, holding something. It was a letter, sealed. The handwriting on the front was formal, the ink dark. "It came 3 days ago," he said. "I didn't want to show you until I'd thought about it." She held out her hand. He gave it to her. She opened it and read it once, then read it again. It was from Crow Mountain Freight. From Silas Crow directly, which was unusual. The billing correspondence she'd found was always from clerks. It was politely worded in the way that things are politely worded when the politeness is a wrapper around a threat. Crow had become aware, the letter said, that there was a new person managing accounts at the Hale Ranch. He wished to extend his personal greetings. He also wished to note that the freight contract was up for renewal at the end of the season and that he looked forward to discussing continued service. He also wished to note, and this part was where the politeness got thinner, that the road easement over the former Dalton property was subject to its own renewal terms, and that he hoped all relevant parties would approach such renewals in a spirit of mutual cooperation. Mutual cooperation. The words sat on the page like a hand resting on a weapon. Maris folded the letter carefully. "He knows I'm here," she said. "Apparently." He knew within 3 weeks. She looked up at Gideon. Someone in Red Hollow told him. Gideon said nothing, because they both knew that Red Hollow was the kind of town where strangers were noticed and news traveled in whatever direction was most convenient for whoever was carrying it. "He's not threatening you yet," Maris said. "He's reminding you he can." "I know what he's doing." She looked at the letter again, then at the stacks of her careful, painstaking documentation spread across the table. 3 weeks of work, dozens of discrepancies cataloged, 4 forged manifests identified, a pattern of fraud that was clear and documented and still completely invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 weeks staring at the numbers the way she had. What she had was evidence that could hurt Silas Crow significantly. What she didn't have yet was enough to stop him, and Crow had just told them, politely, that he was paying attention. She set the letter down on the table beside the ledger. "I need to talk to the families who sold," she said. "Dalton, Mercer, the Havers woman. If they kept any records from before the sales, if they remember their freight billing, even rough numbers, it builds the picture. Those families are scattered. Some moved to Hartson, some farther." "Then I write letters." Gideon looked at her. His face had that particular stillness she was learning to read. Not calm, but the surface on top of something churning. "Crow will intercept them," he said. "He has people at the post office in Red Hollow. Has for years, probably." She thought about this. "Then I don't send them from Red Hollow." "Maris." He said her name the way you say a name when you're about to say something the other person won't want to hear. "He sent this letter because he wanted us to know he's watching. That's all it is at this point, watching. If we push, if we go looking for evidence and he finds out..." "He's already looking at us," she said. "Staying quiet doesn't make us safer. It just gives him more time." The kitchen was quiet except for the wind. Gideon looked at the letter, looked at her documentation, looked at his hands on the table. "I built this ranch in 14 years, he said quietly. Not to her exactly, more to the room. 14 years of work. Before that I had nothing. I had less than nothing. I had..." He stopped, let out a breath. "I can't lose it." "I know," she said. "Then why don't you look scared?" She thought about that honestly. The truth was she was scared. She'd been scared since she found the first duplicate receipt, scared since she understood what the pattern meant, scared since she read the word cooperation in Silas Crow's letter. But she'd spent her entire life scared and doing what needed doing anyway, because the alternative was to stop doing things, and that had never once helped. "Being scared doesn't mean stopping," she said. "It just means you know what's at stake." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but a different quality of attention, like a man seeing something he'd been looking at for weeks in a new light. He reached across the table and picked up the Crow letter. He folded it once, deliberately, and set it aside face down like a card he was declining to play yet. "What do you need first?" he said. And Maris turned back to her ledger because what she needed first was more evidence, and the night was long and Silas Crow was already watching, and the only weapon she'd ever had that she could actually count on was the ability to see what other people missed when they stopped looking carefully. She picked up her pen. She kept looking. She sent the first letters from Hartson. It took Gideon 2 days to arrange it without drawing attention. A supply run that had legitimate reasons behind it. A route that didn't pass through Red Hollow. A contact in Hartson who ran a dry goods operation and had no particular loyalty to Silas Crow. Maris wrote 5 letters in careful, plain language, nothing that would read as accusatory to anyone who intercepted them. She framed each one as an accounting inquiry, a simple request to verify freight records from a former business relationship. She signed them with her name because she had no reason yet to hide it, and hiding it might suggest she already knew more than she wanted Crow to think she knew. She gave the letters to Gideon on a Tuesday morning. He left before sunrise. She spent the day at the kitchen table working through the rest of the receipt box, and by the time he came back at dusk, she had found 3 more forged manifests and a billing entry so brazen in its falsification that she'd actually set it aside and walked outside for 10 minutes just to settle herself before she could look at it again. The entry was for a delivery that, according to Gideon's own inventory notes, had never arrived at all. Crow had charged for a shipment of fencing material in the spring of the previous year. Gideon had recorded in his inventory notebook that the material hadn't come, that he'd sent a query to Crow's office, that the response had been a note claiming the delivery had been made and signed for. There was no signature in Gideon's records. There was a signature in Crow's billing file, a copy of which had been included with the invoice as proof of delivery. Maris had found it tucked into the back of the receipt box, filed there by Gideon, apparently because he hadn't known what to do with it. She looked at the signature for a long time. Then she went and found Gideon's actual signature on two of the legitimate older contracts. They weren't the same, not even close. Someone had signed Gideon Hale's name to a delivery he'd never received and charged him for goods that had never arrived. That wasn't billing fraud, that was forgery. That was a different kind of crime entirely, the kind that carried real consequences, the kind that meant someone in Crow's operation was confident enough in their position to put a false signature on a legal document and trust it would never be examined. When Gideon came in that evening, she put the two documents side by side on the table without saying anything. He looked at them. He looked at his own handwriting on the contract. He looked at the fake signature. "That's not my name," he said. "No." He sat down heavily. He was still in his coat, still dusty from the road, and he sat there looking at a forged version of his own name with an expression that was past anger and into something quieter and more dangerous. "How long has this been going on?" he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a man talking to himself in the presence of someone he'd decided to trust. "Long enough that they got comfortable," Maris said. "Comfortable enough to forge a signature. That's someone who doesn't think they'll ever be looked at. Because no one's ever looked. Until now." He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his face that was gratitude and something else that she didn't have a name for yet, but that sat in the room between them the way heat sits, present and specific, belonging to the particular moment and not to anything else. The responses to her letters started arriving 3 weeks later, not through Red Hollow. She'd given Hartson as the return address. Gideon made 4 more supply runs over the following month, each one with a legitimate reason, each one collecting whatever had come. 3 of the 5 letters got responses. 2 of the responses were brief and wary, people who'd moved on and didn't want to revisit what they'd left behind. But the 3rd response was 6 pages long, written in a handwriting that pressed hard on the paper like the person holding the pen had a great deal of pressure to release. It was from a woman named Clara Dalton, formerly of the Dalton farm to the south. She was living in Hartson now with her sister. She had, she wrote, kept every piece of paper from the last 4 years of the farm's operation because her husband had told her 2 months before he died that something was wrong with the freight billing and he couldn't figure out what it was, but he wanted the records kept just in case. He died before he could pursue it. Claire had kept the records anyway, in a trunk under her sister's guest bed, for almost 2 years, not knowing what to do with them. Maris read that letter 3 times. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. "I need to go to Hartson," she told Gideon that evening. He didn't argue. He drove her himself 2 days later in the wagon on roads that avoided Red Hollow. It was the farthest Maris had been from the ranch since she'd arrived, and the distance felt different than she expected. Not frightening, but strange, like wearing a garment she'd forgotten she owned. Clara Dalton was a small, spare woman in her late 50s with the permanently tired eyes of someone who'd been worried for so long. It had become her natural expression. She met them at her sister's door and looked at Maris for a long moment before stepping back to let them in. "You're the one who wrote," Clara said. "Yes." "You're not from a bank or a land office." "No." "My husband said nobody would ever look at this." She said it without bitterness, just as fact. "He said Crow was too well protected." "He may have been right about that then," Maris said. "Things might be different now." Clara looked at her with the skepticism of a woman who'd been told things were different before. Then she went and got the trunk. The trunk contained 4 years of meticulous records, freight receipts, delivery logs, billing correspondence, and crucially, her husband's own notes in the margins of the billing statements, small, careful annotations in pencil, where he'd written things like incorrect weight, and this load was not 40 schwatt, closer to 33 and duplicate. Check against March, and once, in larger letters that had pressed all the way through the paper, this is not an accident. Maris sat at Clara Dalton's sister's kitchen table for 4 hours. She went through every document. She cross-referenced against her own records from Gideon's ranch. The pattern was identical. Same rate inflation structure, same weight falsification method, same billing timing, same language in the correspondence when queries were raised. It was not the same fraud happening twice independently. It was the same fraud, run from the same place, applied to multiple properties with a consistency that meant it was policy. Deliberate. Systematic. Someone at the top of Crow Mountain Freight had designed this and run it for years. When she finally looked up, Clara was watching her from across the table. "What did you find?" Clara asked. "Enough," Maris said. "I think. Not all of it yet, but enough to show the shape of it." "The shape of it won't get my farm back." "No," Maris agreed. "But it might get someone to look, and once someone official starts looking, Crow has the sheriff." "The county sheriff? Yes." Maris folded the notes she'd taken carefully. "But county sheriffs don't decide federal fraud cases." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband tried to get someone to listen for 2 years. He wrote 3 letters to the territorial office. Nobody answered." Maris thought about the territorial office. She thought about a name she'd seen twice now in Gideon's land documentation. Not Crow's name, a different one, appearing in the approval signatures on land transfer records. Edmund Rourke, Territorial Land Administrator, his signature appearing on documentation that should have been flagged for review and hadn't been. She didn't say that yet. She wasn't ready to say that yet. "Would you be willing to let me copy these records?" Maris asked. "I'll leave you the originals. I'll copy what I need." "You can take them," Clara said. "What do I need with them? My husband's dead and the farm's gone. If they help somebody else, take them." Maris took them. The road back to the ranch was long, and the afternoon was already going golden when they left Hartson, and Maris sat in the wagon with the trunk balanced between her feet, and the weight of it felt different from how it had when she'd carried it in, heavier now with what she knew it contained. Gideon drove without speaking for a while. The horses knew the road. The pines on either side moved in the late afternoon wind. "She kept all of that for 2 years, Maris said, not to start a conversation, but because the thought had too much weight to keep entirely to herself. Didn't know what to do with it, just kept it because her husband asked her to." "People hold on to things when they don't know what else to do," Gideon said. She looked at him sidelong. He was watching the road, his hands loose on the reins in the way of a man who'd driven this particular route enough times that his hands knew it without thinking. "What do you hold on to?" she asked, and then immediately felt she'd overstepped, that the question was too direct for where they were with each other. But he answered it. "This ranch," he said. "That's it, really. That's the whole list." She turned that over. "That's not nothing." "No," he agreed. "It's not." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but was honest, which was a better thing to be. Back at the ranch, Maris spread the Dalton records across the front room floor because the kitchen table wasn't large enough. She worked by lamplight that night and most of the next day, building a master document that charted both properties side by side, the Hale Ranch and the Dalton Farm, showing the parallel structure of the fraud applied to both. The dates aligned, the rate inflation followed the same pattern, the weight falsifications used the same rounding method. By the second evening, she had something that looked, to her eyes, like proof. Not the kind that could go into a court without additional verification, but the kind that made an argument that couldn't be easily dismissed. She was looking at it when she heard hooves on the road. Not Gideon. Gideon was in the barn. These were multiple horses coming fast, which was unusual because the ranch road was a dead end, and the only people who came up it had business here. She went to the window, 3 riders. She didn't recognize them at first in the failing light, but she recognized the quality of them. The deliberate way they sat their horses, the way they spread out as they came through the gate rather than riding single file, which was not how men came to call, but how men came to intimidate. Gideon came out of the barn. The lead rider pulled up in front of him. Maris couldn't hear the words from inside, but she watched the conversation. The writer doing most of the talking, Gideon standing absolutely still with his arms at his sides. In that particular stillness, she'd come to understand was not calm. After 2 minutes, the lead writer held out something, an envelope, and Gideon took it. The writers left the way they'd come, fast, not looking back. Gideon came inside. He put the envelope on the table beside her documents without opening it. "Crow's men," he said. "I assumed." He opened it then. It was 2 pages. The first page was a notice of freight contract non-renewal. Crow Mountain Freight was terminating service to the Hale Ranch at the end of the current season, 30 days hence. The second page was a notice that the road easement over the former Dalton property was under review and that access could not be guaranteed past the contract termination date. 30 days. Maris read both pages twice. She set them down. "He's moving faster than I thought," she said. "He's watched enough farms fold. He knows the timing." Gideon sat down across from her. His voice was level in the way that things go level right before they go the opposite. "Without freight service, I can't move cattle. Without the road, I can't move anything. In 60 days, the ranch is functionally isolated. He wants you to sell. He wants me to have no choice." Maris looked at her documentation spread across the table. Weeks of work. A clear record of systematic fraud. Evidence that would matter to the right audience. But the right audience was federal investigators who were not here, who might take months to respond, who existed on the other side of a system that Silas Crow had been carefully managing for years. 30 days was not months. "His mail operation," she said slowly. Gideon looked at her. "What about it?" She was thinking out loud, which was something she'd stopped apologizing for in the second week at the ranch, when Gideon had made it clear he'd rather hear her think than wait for polished conclusions. "Crow uses his freight network to deliver mail through the valley. Contracts with 4 or 5 towns, including Red Hollow. He carries the post because it gives him visibility into what people are communicating and because it's another income stream." "Right. But that means he's a contracted mail carrier, which means he operates under federal postal regulations, which means the Federal Postal Authority has jurisdiction over his operation in ways that the county sheriff doesn't." Gideon was very still. "You want to use the postal contract against him? He's been intercepting correspondence. I'm reasonably certain of it. Your letters, probably other people's. If he's interfering with the mail as a contracted carrier, that's a federal offense separate from the freight fraud. It's a faster path to federal attention. You'd have to prove he's interfecting mail. I'd have to create a situation where the interference is demonstrable." She looked at him. "I need to send something that he'll interfere with, and I need to be able to prove he did." Gideon thought about this for a moment. "That's not simple." "No, but it's faster than waiting for federal investigators to respond to a fraud complaint that goes through the territorial office." She paused. "Especially if the territorial office is compromised." She hadn't told him yet about Edmund Rourke. She told him now. The signatures, the land transfer approvals, the pattern of official documentation that should have flagged Crow's acquisitions and hadn't. Gideon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "So Crow has someone inside the territorial administration." "I think so. I can't prove it yet. But if I'm right, any complaint that goes through official territorial channels gets quietly buried. Which means we can't use the normal routes. Which means we go around them." She pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her. "I need to think about this." "Think out loud," he said. She did. The plan that came together over the next 2 evenings was not elegant. It was the kind of plan that emerges from limited resources and a ticking clock, held together by logic and necessity and a calculated understanding of how a man like Silas Crow thought. Crow believed he was dealing with a mountain rancher who'd never looked at his own books carefully enough to understand what was being done to him. He'd sent the termination notice as a pressure move, expecting the pressure to produce a sale, not a response. He was watching, but he was watching for the obvious things: a legal challenge, a loan inquiry, a desperate scramble for alternative freight options. He was not watching for Maris to use his own mail network against him. She wrote 3 letters. The first was to a federal postal inspector in the nearest regional office, a real letter making a real complaint about suspected mail interference by a contracted carrier. She gave specific details: dates, the timing of correspondence she believed had been intercepted, the pattern she'd observed. She sent this one from Hartson through a postal box that had no connection to the ranch. The second letter was bait. It was addressed to a fictional attorney in a distant city, discussing Trump in careful, specific language, a planned legal action against Crow Mountain Freight. The language was technical enough to sound real and alarming enough to be interesting to anyone reading it who shouldn't be. She sent this one through Red Hollow's post office, on purpose, knowing it would either arrive at its fictional destination or it wouldn't. If it didn't, if it disappeared, as she expected it to, that was evidence of interference with the mail. The third letter was the one that frightened her most to write. It was addressed to Clara Dalton in Hartson. It was not bait. It was real. It told Clara what Maris had found, what she believed, what she was doing about it, and it asked Clara if she would be willing to make a formal statement to federal investigators if the time came. She sent that one through a circuit rider she'd heard about from Gideon, a man who carried private correspondence through the back routes, who was not associated with Crow's network, who charged twice what the regular post cost and was worth every cent of it. Then she waited. Waiting was harder than working. She kept her hands busy with the documentation, kept refining and organizing, kept building the case document that laid everything out in clear sequential order: the fraud, the forgeries, the false signature, the Dalton parallel records, the timeline of land acquisitions, the role of the easement as a pressure mechanism. She wrote it the way she imagined a federal investigator would want to read it, chronologically, with every claim supported by a specific document reference. Nothing asserted that wasn't evidenced. It was the most complex thing she'd ever built. It was also, she knew, the most important thing she'd ever done. On the 12th day after she sent the bait letter, a man came to the ranch. He wasn't one of Crow's riders. He was alone, middle-aged, wearing town clothes that were too clean for the road he'd clearly traveled to get here, arriving on a horse that was better quality than his clothes suggested. The kind of horse a man chooses when he needs to move reliably and not be noticed. He introduced himself as a deputy postal inspector named Harrison Cole. He said he'd received a complaint about mail interference by a contracted carrier. He said he was making preliminary inquiries. He said he'd appreciate the opportunity to look at whatever documentation she had. He said the bait letter she'd sent to the fictional attorney had been opened, resealed badly, and delivered to the fictional address, where, as it happened, the Postal Service did maintain a receiving box for exactly this kind of investigative operation. A fact she hadn't known, but which had been, Cole told her with a carefully neutral expression, a useful development. Maris sat across from Harrison Cole at the kitchen table and put 6 weeks of documentation in front of him. She walked him through it without performance, without drama, in the same plain, careful voice she'd used to explain the duplicated receipts to Gideon on that Sunday afternoon weeks ago. She showed him the freight fraud. She showed him the forged signature. She showed him the Dalton parallel records. She showed him the termination notices and the easement threat. She told him about Edmund Rourke's signatures on the land transfers and what she believed that meant. Cole took notes. He didn't react visibly to most of it. When she showed him the forged signature, he looked at it for a long time and then looked at the legitimate Gideon Hale's signature beside it and wrote something down without commenting. When she finished, he sat back and looked at his notes and then at her. "How long did this take you to put together?" he asked. 6 weeks. "You trained as an accountant?" "No." He looked at her for a moment. "How did you learn to read freight contracts and billing manifests?" "I read carefully," she said, "and I had a reason to look." Cole closed his notebook. "I'll need to take copies of the primary documents. I'll need statements from you and from the ranch owner, and from the Dalton woman in Hartson if she'll give one." "She'll give one," Maris said. She was certain of it. "This is going to move slowly," Cole said, not unkindly. "Federal investigations aren't fast, and if what you're suggesting about the territorial administrator is accurate, it's going to become more complicated before it gets simpler." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "But you're here. That means someone's paying attention." "Someone's paying attention," he agreed. He picked up the forged signature document and looked at it again. "This alone is a serious matter. This is someone who thought they'd never be caught." "People usually do," Maris said, "when no one's ever bothered to look." Cole left before dark with copies of everything she could spare. He gave her a contact address in the regional federal office, not through the local mail system he specified, through the Hartson postal box. He told her to document anything that happened in the next weeks, any further contact from Crow or his associates, any changes in access to the road or freight service. He also told her, in the tone of someone saying something carefully, that the investigation would take the course it took, and she should not expect outcomes she couldn't control. She understood what he meant. She understood that federal investigations moved in federal time, that evidence had to be processed and verified and built into a case that would survive legal challenge, that this was not the end of anything, but possibly the beginning of something that might, in time, produce an end. 30 days was still 30 days. When Cole was gone and the sound of his horse had faded down the road, Gideon came in from the porch where he'd been standing with his back against the wall the way he stood when he was thinking. He didn't ask how it went. He could read the room. "We bought time," Maris said. "Maybe, if Cole does what he said and if it moves fast enough." "And if it doesn't?" She looked at her hands on the table. They were ink-stained from weeks of writing. She had a callus on her right middle finger from the pen that she hadn't had when she'd arrived. "Then we go to Red Hollow," she said. Gideon frowned. "You said going to Red Hollow was the last option." "It is." She looked up at him. "But if the federal process isn't going to move fast enough to stop Crow before he closes the road, then the only thing left is making his actions visible to enough people that he can't take them quietly." She paused. "Crow's power depends on people not comparing notes. Every farm he's bled dry, every family he's pressured into selling, they each thought it was just them. They each thought they were alone in it. If they saw it all together, if they saw that it was the same operation done to all of them, that it was a system and not bad luck. You want to take it public," Gideon said. "I want to take it to the people it happened to," she said, "and let them decide what to do with it." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him calculating the risk of it, the exposure, the fact that going to Red Hollow meant going back to the place that had sold her 2 months ago and standing in front of the same people who had laughed and looked away. "That's going to be hard," he said. "Not a discouragement, just an observation." "I know," she said. She knew. She'd been thinking about it since she read Crow's termination letter, since the 30-day clock had started. She'd been thinking about it in the quiet way she thought about things that frightened her. Steadily, at a distance, turning them over until the fear had shape and the shape could be planned around. Going back to Red Hollow was not something she wanted. But wanting and willing were different things, and Maris Rowan had known the difference for a long time. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines and the night settled in around the ranch, and somewhere down in the valley, in the town that had sold her and the office that had stolen from her and the empire that had been built on the assumption that nobody would ever look carefully enough to see it, Silas Crow was waiting for a mountain rancher to run out of options. He had not accounted for the woman doing the accounting. The morning they drove to Red Hollow, it rained. Not the soft kind of rain that makes everything look washed and new. The hard, grudging kind that comes sideways off the mountain and turns road dirt into something that grabs at wagon wheels and doesn't let go. Gideon drove and Maris sat beside him with the document case on her lap and her hands flat on top of it, keeping it dry under her coat, and neither of them talked much because there wasn't much to say that the rain wasn't already saying for them. 18 days had passed since Harrison Cole's visit. 12 days remained on Crow's termination notice. Cole had sent one message through the Hartson postal box, Chet. Brief, professional, telling them the investigation was active and that additional federal personnel had been assigned to the case. He did not say how quickly things would move. He did not say anything that would constitute a promise. 12 days. Maris had spent those 18 days doing two things simultaneously. She'd continued building the master case document, adding Clara Dalton's formal written statement, which had arrived through the circuit rider 8 days after she'd sent the request. 6 pages, handwritten, precise, in the way of a woman who'd been waiting a long time to say something and had thought carefully about how to say it. And she'd been writing a different kind of document entirely, one that was not for federal investigators but for ordinary people, farmers, widows, laborers, The kind of people who didn't read legal briefs but who understood plain language and their own experience and the specific arithmetic of being taken from slowly until there was nothing left. She'd written it 6 times before she had something she thought was right. Not dramatic, not a speech, just the facts laid out in the order they happened, with numbers that anyone could check against their own records, if they'd kept them, and a question at the end that she'd rewritten more times than anything else in it. The question was simple. Does this look familiar to you? She had 40 copies. She'd written them herself over 3 nights at the kitchen table, Gideon occasionally bringing coffee without being asked and not commenting on how late it was getting. Her right hand had cramped twice. She'd kept writing. The town of Red Hollow appeared through the rain in the way of things you've been dreading, sooner than you're ready for, and smaller than the dread had made it seem. It was market day again, as it had been the morning Thomas Rowan had dragged her onto that platform. Maris had planned it that way. Market day was the one day the valley's scattered farms and ranches brought people into town. The one day you could find in one place people who otherwise lived miles apart and never crossed paths. Gideon pulled the wagon up near the feed store and set the brake, and they sat for a moment looking at the main street through the rain. "You don't have to come in," Maris said. "I know. This is my fight more than yours." "It's my ranch," he said, "and my forged signature, and my money he stole." He climbed down from the wagon. "You going to keep listing reasons for me to stay out here, or are we going in?" She climbed down. The feed store was the largest covered space in Red Hollow that wasn't the saloon or the church, and on rain-soaked market days the farmers gathered there anyway, doing informal business under shelter while their wagons sat outside getting wet. Maris had counted on this. She'd counted on the feed store being crowded, and she'd counted on market day, and she'd counted on the rain, all 3, because she needed people in one place, and she needed a reason for them to stay there. She walked in ahead of Gideon. The space smelled of grain and damp coats, and the particular animal warmth of too many people in too small a building. She recognized most of the faces. Red Hollow was not a large town, and she'd lived near it her whole life. She saw the recognition move through the room in a wave, the same wave she'd felt in the square that market day months ago, but running in the opposite direction. Not the crowd parting to let something unpleasant pass, the crowd stilling to understand what it was seeing. Maris Rowan, the woman Thomas Rowan had sold. Standing in the feed store on a rainy market day looking like she had something to say. She put the document case on the nearest flat surface, the edge of a grain bin, and opened it. "I know some of you," she said. She didn't raise her voice especially. The rain on the roof covered the worst of the ambient noise, and the room was already going quiet. "I grew up here. My father is Thomas Rowan. Some of you were in the square when he sold me on a platform in August, and I'm not here to talk about that." She paused. "I'm here because most of you use Crow Mountain Freight to move your goods, and I need about 10 minutes of your time." A man near the back said, "We don't have business with you, Maris." She knew the voice without turning to look. Clement Hicks, who had auctioned her off like a piece of equipment, and who was now looking at her with the expression of a man hoping a problem would move on. "You will after today," she said, and turned back to the room. She started with the numbers. Not the legal argument, not the fraud language. The numbers, plain and specific. She held up the chart she'd built showing the freight rate history, and she explained it in the same plain language she'd used in her written document. What the contracted rate was. What had been charged. The difference, year by year, adding up. She watched faces in the room shift. Not dramatically, the slow shift of people recognizing something. A farmer named Gruber, who ran an operation on the eastern side of the valley, said, "My rates went up too." Crow said it was fuel. "It wasn't fuel," Maris said. "The rate in your contract has a 3% annual maximum increase clause. I'd need to see your bills to be certain, but based on what I've found across multiple properties, I'd estimate you've been overcharged by somewhere between $200 and $400 over the past 3 years. Gruber stared at her. She moved through the room, handing out copies of her plain language document to anyone who would take one. Some people took them immediately. Some waited to see what others did first. A few didn't take them at all, watching with the careful neutrality of people waiting to assess which way the wind was going before they leaned. She got to the weight falsification. The manifests listing heavier loads than had been delivered. She explained how to check it if you kept your own inventory records. She watched a woman in the middle of the room, gray-haired, work-worn, pull out a small notebook from her coat pocket and start flipping through pages. That was Vera Havers, the widow from the farm at the base of the ridge. Maris recognized her with a start. She'd thought the woman had left the valley entirely. Vera Havers looked up from her notebook. "My loads have been short 3 years running," she said. "I thought it was theft at the warehouse. Crow's people told me it was the warehouse." "It wasn't the warehouse," Maris said. Vera looked at her notebook, looked at Maris. Something in her face went very hard. Clement Hicks pushed through toward the front. "Now listen here. Silas Crow is a respected businessman. You can't come in here and—" "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," Maris said, keeping her voice level. "I'm showing you documents and I'm asking you to compare them against your own records. That's all. If the numbers don't match what you've experienced, ignore everything I've said." She looked at Hicks directly. "If they do match, that's a different conversation." Hicks looked around the room for backup. He found less than he expected. The feed store had gone very quiet except for the rain, and several people were looking at the papers Maris had handed them with the focused expression of people doing arithmetic. That was when the door opened. Maris felt the change in the room before she'd fully processed who had come in. The air shifted. Not the shift of weather, the shift of a threat entering an enclosed space. 2 men. She didn't know them specifically, but she knew the type. Not Crow's freight workers, the other kind. The kind that weren't listed on any payroll but showed up when Crow needed a message delivered in person. They were big, unhurried, and they stood at the door in a way that positioned them between the room and the exit without being obvious about it. Behind them, a third man. She'd never seen Silas Crow in person. She'd built a picture of him from his documents and his billing style and his carefully polite, threatening letters, and the picture she'd built was of a man who was careful, controlled, precise. A man who wore his power quietly because quiet power was harder to fight than loud power. The man who walked in matched the picture. He was perhaps 60, well-dressed in the way of a man who'd been rich long enough that it no longer required effort. His face was contained, not cold exactly, but sealed, the expression of someone who'd decided a long time ago that what he felt was his own business. He looked at Maris with eyes that assessed rather than emoted, and what she saw in them was not anger. Not yet. It was the look of a man recalibrating, who had arrived expecting one situation and found another. The room waited. "Miss Rowan," Crow said. His voice was even and pleasant and carried naturally without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "I heard you were making a presentation. I thought I'd attend." "You're welcome to," Maris said, "though I'd note that most of what I'm presenting is your own billing records." A thin smile. "Records can be misread by people without the proper context." "That's true," she said. "Would you like to provide the context for why Gideon Hale's signature appears on a delivery confirmation for materials that were never delivered to his property?" Something moved behind Crow's eyes, just a flicker, quickly controlled. "Clerical errors happen," he said. 19 of them in 3 years, all running in the same direction?" She held up the rate chart. "All of them increasing your revenue and decreasing your client's capital?" She heard her voice staying steady and was surprised by it, because her heart was doing something unpleasant in her chest, and her hands wanted to shake. "That's not a clerical error pattern, that's a business model." Crow took a few steps forward into the room. His 2 men stayed at the door. The effect was subtle. Maris was now between him and the exit, but she noticed it, and she saw from the slight shift in Gideon's posture near the wall that he'd noticed it too. "I came to offer a resolution," Crow said, and now he addressed the room rather than just Maris, the pivot smooth and practiced. "Miss Rowan is clearly a capable young woman who has gone to considerable trouble to compile documents that she believes tell a story. I respect that effort. What I'd propose is a review process, an independent accountant chosen by both parties to examine any billing disputes. Clients with legitimate concerns will be compensated appropriately." He spread his hands. "That's a fair offer." He said it well. Maris could hear the room considering it. The appeal of a path that didn't require confrontation, that offered money without requiring anyone to take a side. "That's a good offer," Maris said. Crow looked at her, slightly surprised. "It's the right offer for billing disputes," she continued. "But billing disputes aren't the whole of it. She turned back to the room. Silas Crow's company controls freight access for most of the valley. He also owns the road easements that several properties depend on for access. He's currently using those easements as leverage against Gideon Hale's ranch, threatening to close road access unless Hale sells. That's not a billing dispute. That's coercion. A murmur through the room. Not loud. The specific, serious murmur of people who understood what coercion of road access meant for isolated properties. A man Maris didn't know said, "He owns the Dalton Road?" "For 18 months, Maris said, and the Mercer access, and the ridge easement that the Havers property uses, though Mrs. Havers may not have been notified of the change in ownership." Vera Havers, still holding her notebook, turned to look at Crow. Crow's pleasant expression had gone through several adjustments in the last 30 seconds. It was still there, but thinner. "Land ownership is a matter of public record," he said. "There's nothing improper about—" "Then you won't object to the federal postal inspector looking at your land acquisition timeline alongside your freight billing records," Maris said, "since he's already looking." That landed differently than anything else she'd said. The room went so quiet that the rain on the roof was suddenly very loud. Crow looked at her. For the first time, the sealed expression cracked slightly, not into emotion exactly, but into the bare edge of it, the place where the control was working hardest. "Federal involvement is unnecessary," he said carefully. "These are local matters." "Mail interference isn't a local matter," Maris said. "Neither is document forgery." She held up the forged signature. "And neither, I suspect, is whatever arrangement exists between your land office and the territorial administrator's office, though that part I'll leave to the investigators to characterize." Edmund Rourke's name was in the room now, without her having said it, hanging there in the way that unsaid things sometimes hang, present, specific, dangerous. Crow went very still. One of his men at the door shifted his weight. It was not a threatening movement exactly, but it was the kind of movement that preceded one, and Gideon Hale moved away from the wall at the same moment in a way that put him between the man and Maris without appearing to. Nobody spoke for 3 seconds. Then Gruber the farmer said, from the middle of the room, in the slow, flat voice of a man who'd made a decision, "I've got 5 years of billing records at home. If an investigator wants to look at them, he's welcome." Vera Havers said, without looking up from her notebook. "Same?" A woman at the back, Maris didn't know her name, she was from one of the outlying properties, said, "My husband's been saying for 2 years something was wrong with our freight bills. He'll want to talk to somebody about it." It was not a dramatic moment. It wasn't the kind of scene where people rise up all at once and righteousness sweeps through a crowd like fire. It was slower and more uncertain than that, people looking at papers, looking at their own memories, looking at each other to see if their experience was shared, finding that it was, and making the small individual decision to say so out loud. One voice, then another, then 3 at once. Crow turned and looked at his men. Whatever signal passed between them was subtle, a slight tightening around his eyes. But both men moved, and the intention was clear enough that Gideon stepped fully in front of Maris. "Don't," Gideon said. One word, quiet. He wasn't physically imposing in any theatrical way, but he had the absolute stillness of someone who had been in situations that required it and was not afraid of what came next. The man closest to him looked at his face and stopped, Crow said, with his pleasant voice now doing the very minimum required to keep the surface smooth. "Miss Rowan, you've made your point, but you should understand that making accusations you can't support in a court of law has consequences." "I have support," she said. "That's what I've been explaining for the last 20 minutes. Paper from a ranch account book, paper from 6 properties so far," she said, "and a federal investigator who has copies, and a postal inspector who witnessed the mail interference personally." She paused. "And 40 copies of a summary document that are now in the hands of the people in this room, most of whom are your clients, and some of whom have just told you they'll speak to investigators." She met his eyes. "What exactly were you planning to do? Come in here and make it all go away with a pleasant voice?" Something crossed his face. It was brief, and it was ugly, and it was honest, and it was the first honest thing she'd seen from him. His men moved back to the door. Crow straightened his coat. "You've made a significant enemy today," he said. "I had one before today," she said. "The difference is now you know I know it. Crow left. His men left behind him. The door swung shut and the rain filled the silence, and then everyone in the feed store seemed to breathe at the same time, a collective exhale of a room that had been holding itself carefully for the last 20 minutes. Gruber said, to no one in particular, "Well," Maris's hands were shaking. She became aware of it when she tried to close the document case, and the clasp didn't cooperate on the first try. She forced herself to be methodical about it. Clasp, then latch, then set it down. She turned away from the room for a moment, ostensibly to arrange the remaining copies, actually to give herself 3 seconds of not being looked at. Gideon came up beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was enough. She turned back around. Vera Havers was in front of her with the notebook still in hand. "I need to show you something," Vera said. "In these pages, if you have time." "I have time," Maris said. They sat together at the edge of the grain bin, and Vera opened the notebook, and what she showed Maris were 5 years of a careful woman's careful notes. Delivery dates, weights, amounts, all recorded in the small, neat handwriting of someone who'd grown up learning that the difference between surviving and not surviving was paying attention to the details. Vera's numbers told the same story Maris's numbers told. The same pattern, the same structure, the same deliberate bleeding of a property that a person had built and loved and eventually been forced to surrender. "I didn't sell," Vera said quietly. "Not yet. He hasn't made a formal offer, but my road, the easement, he sent me a letter last month saying it was under review." "The same letter he sent Gideon," Maris said. "Is it too late for mine?" "Not if you give a statement to the federal investigator," Maris said. "Not if we document everything you have here." She looked at the notebook. "This is good, Vera. This is very good. You kept all of this." "My husband said always write it down." Vera looked at the notebook for a moment. "He died 4 years ago. I kept writing it down anyway. Didn't know what else to do with it." Maris thought of Clara Dalton and her trunk full of papers and her husband's penciled notes in the margins. 2 women keeping records for dead men who'd known something was wrong. 2 women who'd kept the evidence alive without knowing if anyone would ever come to look at it. She'd looked. She was still looking. The feed store gradually returned to ordinary market day business. People talking, a few clustered around the copies she'd distributed, comparing notes in the low, serious voices of people doing math. Gruber shook her hand before he left and said he'd get his records together. A young man she didn't know asked for 2 copies instead of 1, saying his neighbor had the same freight carrier and he wanted to show him. An older woman pressed her hand and said nothing but held it for a moment longer than necessary. Clement Hicks left without speaking to her. Sheriff Alton, who had been standing near the back of the room with his thumbs in his belt, exactly as he'd stood in the square months ago watching her be auctioned, came over as the crowd thinned. He looked at her with the expression of a man performing a calculation. "Crow's going to respond to this," he said. "I expect so," Maris said. "You understand I'm limited in what I can do if this goes sideways." "I understand you've been limited for years," she said. "That's part of the problem." His jaw tightened. He looked at Gideon, then back at her. "The federal boys," he said, "if they come through here officially, they'll want my cooperation." "They will." "I'd cooperate," he said, and it was as close to a commitment as she suspected he was capable of making, and she accepted it for what it was rather than what it wasn't. On the drive back up the mountain, the rain eased and then stopped, and the afternoon sun came through the clouds in the particular way it does after mountain rain, sideways and golden and more beautiful than anything deserves to be when you're too tired to properly appreciate it. Maris sat with the nearly empty document case on her lap. "Crow will move fast now," Gideon said. "Yes. He'll try to collect whatever evidence he can get his hands on, ledgers, manifests, anything that could contradict what you've put together." "I know." She'd thought about this. "But Cole has copies of the primary documents, and Clara Dalton has her originals in Hartson. Even if Crow destroys his own copies, what about the families, the ones who took your documents today?" She'd thought about that too. "I'll write to Cole tonight and tell him what happened in the feed store. He needs to know there are additional witnesses and records. He needs to move to collect statements before Crow's people get to them." Gideon drove in silence for a moment. Then, "You weren't scared in there." She laughed, and it came out shorter and rougher than she intended. I was terrified in there. You didn't look it. I looked like someone who didn't have the option of looking terrified. She turned her face toward the window, watching the wet pines go by. It's not the same as not being scared. He absorbed that. When Crow said you'd made an enemy, I know. He wasn't being theatrical about it. I know that too. She kept looking at the pines. When I was standing on that platform in August, everyone in the square was an enemy of mine in some sense. Not active. They weren't trying to hurt me. They just weren't trying to help me either. They looked away or they laughed. That was enough. She paused. Silas Crow is a different kind of problem, but at least he's a visible one. Gideon said, if he moves against the ranch directly, tries to enforce the road closure before the investigation is far enough along, then we deal with it. She finally looked at him. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly how, but I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks, and every path I can see that doesn't involve just rolling over has some version of the same risk in it. What's the risk? That we move before we're ready, or that we wait and he moves first. She held the document case tighter for a moment. There's no clean version of this. There was never going to be. He nodded. That was all. The acceptance of it, uncomplicated, which she'd come to understand was one of the ways Gideon Hale showed respect, not with reassurance, but with honest acknowledgement of what was true. They were 3 miles from the ranch when he said, without particular lead-up, I want to say something and I want to say it plainly. She looked at him. What you did today, and before today, the weeks of work, going to Hartson, building all of it, that's not something I asked of you. I hired you to manage accounts. What you actually did is considerably more than that. It needed doing. A lot of things need doing that people don't do, he said. I want you to know that I see the difference. He kept his eyes on the road. I've been alone a long time, longer than I've had this ranch, which you know is 14 years. I got very good at managing everything myself because I had to, but I got used to there being nothing that wasn't mine to manage alone. He was choosing his words with the care of a man not accustomed to this kind of sentence. Having someone to stand beside in that feed store today, it mattered more than I'm probably saying well. Maris looked at the road ahead of them. You stood in front of me when his man moved, she said. That's not, he started. I know what it is and what it isn't, she said quietly. I'm just noting that you did it. They said nothing else for the rest of the drive, but the silence between them had shifted in some degree, moved into different territory, and they both knew it, and neither of them tried to name it yet, because some things said too early become smaller than they were when they were still unsaid. 4 days later, the letter came, not from Cole, not from Crow, from a name she didn't recognize at first. A law office in the territorial capital, sending a document that required Gideon Hale's immediate response regarding the road easement over the Dalton parcel, framing the matter in language that suggested imminent legal action to enforce closure. 4 days. Crow had moved in 4 days. Maris read the letter twice. It was aggressive, but it had a specific quality she recognized. It was drafted quickly. The language had a hurry in it that careful legal documents didn't have. Crow was rushing because she'd changed his timeline, because the feed store had happened and witnesses were now involved, and he needed to move on the road before federal investigators made that move impossible. Rushing men made mistakes. She'd read enough of his documents to know that when Crow was unhurried, he was meticulous. Hurried, he might miss something. She put the letter on the table and picked up her pen. She had 4 days' worth of new evidence from the families in Red Hollow that needed to be organized, copied, and sent to Cole. She had Vera Haver's notebook to cross-reference against the master document. She had a response to draft to the law office that would buy time without giving ground. And she had the thing she'd noticed when she first read the legal letter. A name in the signature block, below the attorney's name, in the capacity of authorizing official. Edmund Rourke. His signature on a legal letter from a private law office. Not a territorial administrative document, a private legal action. Which meant Edmund Rourke was not merely approving Crow's land transfers in his official capacity. He was actively participating in the legal pressure campaign against private property owners. That wasn't administrative corruption. That was conspiracy. She sat with that for 1 full minute. Let it settle. Let it be what it was. Then she started writing. Outside, the mountain held its position the way mountains do, indifferent to what happened in the valley below and the houses on its slopes, and the people inside those houses fighting their various battles. The sun moved across the sky. The pines made their sound. The ranch went about its business. And at the kitchen table, with ink-stained hands and a callus on her writing finger and 40 days of accumulated knowledge of a fraud that had stolen from dozens of people for years, Maris Rowan built the case that neither Silas Crow nor Edmund Rourke had believed anyone would ever bother to build. She was not finished. She was, for the first time in the whole of it, certain she was going to finish. The response from Cole came on the 8th day after the feed store, not through the Hartson postal box, but in person, which told Maris everything she needed to know about how seriously the Postal Inspection Office was now treating the case. Cole arrived with another man he introduced only as Investigator Marsh, Federal Fraud Division, which was a title that sounded bureaucratic until you looked at Marsh's eyes, which were the flat, patient eyes of someone who had been doing this work for 20 years and had stopped being surprised by what people did to each other, for money, but had not stopped being interested in it. They sat at Gideon's kitchen table, all four of them, and Maris put the Edmund Rourke letter in the center of the table first before anything else, because she decided in the 4 days since it arrived that it was the most important thing she had, and she wanted them to see it before their minds settled into whatever framework they'd arrived with. Marsh picked it up. Read it again, set it down. "When did this arrive yet?" he asked. 4 days ago. "You didn't contact us immediately." "I didn't have a fast way to contact you that didn't risk interception," she said, "and I spent the 4 days documenting the Rourke connection fully before I could show you something complete rather than something partial." She put the supplementary document in front of him, 12 pages, every instance of Rourke's signature she'd found, cross-referenced against the timeline of Crow's land acquisitions, and the dates of complaints that had apparently gone nowhere through official territorial channels. Marsh read it the way investigators read things. Not quickly, but with a quality of attention that was almost physical, like he was pressing his fingers into the text to feel for gaps. Cole looked at Maris over the top of his coffee cup. "You built this in 4 days?" "I built most of it over the past 6 weeks," she said. "The Rourke section took 4 days." Marsh set the document down. He looked at Gideon. "The road closure notice. Has it been executed?" "Not yet," Gideon said. "The legal letter gave a 14-day response window. We have 10 days remaining." "We'll need those 10 days." Marsh looked back at Maris. "The mail interference case is already being built. The additional witnesses from your feed store presentation. We've made contact with 3 of them in the past 48 hours. Their records are consistent with what you documented." He paused. "The Rourke element changes the complexity of this significantly. If a territorial official is actively participating in a private legal pressure campaign against property owners, that moves this from fraud investigation into conspiracy territory, and conspiracy territory involves different jurisdictions and different timelines." "How different?" Gideon asked. "Longer," Marsh said flatly, "potentially significantly longer." The kitchen was quiet. The 10 days sat in the room like a physical object. "What happens to the ranch if the road closes while the investigation is ongoing?" Maris asked, though she already knew the answer. "That would be a civil matter between the property owner and the easement holder," Marsh said. "The investigation doesn't automatically suspend civil proceedings." "So Crow closes the road, the ranch is isolated, and the investigation takes months." She said it plainly, not as a complaint, but as a map of the situation. "And an isolated ranch with no freight access can't operate, which means eventually it can't service its debt, which means Crow gets what he wanted, regardless of what the investigation finds later." Marsh looked at her with the particular expression of a federal investigator who knows the answer to something but can't make it simpler than it is. "That's a possible outcome, yes." Gideon's hands on the table went to the still position. Maris looked at the document case on the chair beside her. 6 weeks of work, 40 copies distributed in a feed store, letters sent across the valley, 3 properties worth of parallel records, a forged signature, a postal inspector who'd personally witnessed mail interference, and now a conspiracy connection to a territorial official. It was substantial. It was real. It was also sitting on the wrong side of a 10-day clock. "What can you do in 10 days?" she asked Marsh. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. We can accelerate the fraud documentation and submit for an emergency injunction against the road closure on the grounds that it's an action taken in furtherance of ongoing criminal activity. That's not guaranteed. It requires a federal judge to agree on an expedited basis. But the mail interference evidence gives us federal jurisdiction, and the Rourke connection gives us a compelling argument for why the normal civil channels can't be trusted. He folded his hands. It's possible. It's not certain. What do you need from us? Everything you have, organized for submission, by tomorrow morning. She'd been doing this for 6 weeks. She knew exactly what she had and where everything was. You'll have it tonight, she said. Marsh allowed himself a small, genuine expression of something that wasn't quite surprise but was close. Tonight. I'll help, Gideon said, looking at Maris. She looked at him. He'd never once, in 6 weeks, offered to help with the documentation work. He'd brought coffee and driven wagons and stood in front of threatening men in a feed store. But the papers and the numbers and the writing, he'd left entirely to her, not because he didn't care, but because he understood the difference between his skills and hers and didn't pretend otherwise. The offer now meant something specific, that he understood this was the moment when everything needed to be in the same place, and he was willing to do whatever part of that he could. Can you write clearly? She asked. Clearly enough. Then I'll dictate the organization and you copy. It'll go faster. They worked through the night. It was not organized work. It was the kind of work that happens under time pressure when the stakes are real. Things found in the wrong order, sections that needed to be redone because the language wasn't precise enough. Twice Maris stopped and reread something and found a discrepancy she'd missed earlier that needed to be addressed before the document could stand on its own. Gideon wrote when she dictated and didn't complain about the pace or the hours, and only once, around 2 a.m, said quietly that there was cold chicken in the pantry if she wanted to stop for 5 minutes and eat something. She ate standing up over the sink and was back at the table in 4 minutes. By 4 a.m, they had a complete submission document, 47 pages, every claim sourced to a specific exhibit, the exhibits numbered and referenced consistently throughout, the Rourke material integrated into the fraud timeline in a way that showed not just his involvement, but its functional role in the scheme. She read it through once from start to finish, found 2 small errors, corrected them, read the corrected pages again. Is it done? Gideon asked. He was sitting back in his chair with his coat still on and the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been writing for 6 hours and whose handwriting had deteriorated noticeably in the last 2. It's done, she said. She sat back too and looked at it. 47 pages that had started as a box of disorganized receipts and a ledger a man couldn't balance because someone was making sure it wouldn't balance. 47 pages that were also, in some accounting she couldn't have articulated clearly, a record of what she'd become in the months since a man on a horse had asked one question in a dusty square. She didn't say that. It wasn't the time and wasn't the kind of thing she said easily, but she thought it in the 4 a.m. quiet of the kitchen. Cole and Marsh took the submission at 7 the following morning. Marsh read the key sections on the spot, standing at the door, because he'd said he would review it before leaving, and he was the kind of man who did what he said he'd do. He made 2 notations in his own copy and said he would contact them through the Hartson postal box within 48 hours with an update on the injunction application. He left. Cole followed, then paused at the door. Miss Rowan, he said. The forged signature. The one on the false delivery confirmation. That's the piece that's going to matter most in a courtroom. Not because it's the largest fraud, but because it's the clearest. It's the one that can't be explained as a clerical error or misunderstanding of contract terms. He paused. You found it in a box of receipts that had been sitting unexamined for 3 years. Yes, she said. Most people wouldn't have looked. Most people hadn't spent their whole life being told they weren't worth looking at, she said. It makes you notice things. Cole nodded slowly, in the way of a man understanding something that isn't quite what he expected to understand. Then he left. The injunction came through on the 7th day, not on the 48-hour timeline Marsh had estimated, which had stretched to 4 days of silence that Maris had spent continuing to work, organizing the additional records that Gruber and Vera Havers had sent through, corresponding with Clara Dalton about her formal deposition, drafting responses to the legal office's road closure notice that raised procedural objections designed to consume time, And on the fifth day, a message arrived from Cole that said only the application was before a federal judge and to hold their position. On the seventh day, 3 days before the road closure deadline, the injunction was granted. Crow Mountain Freight and all affiliated entities were enjoined from taking any action affecting road access, freight service, or land use pertaining to properties under active federal fraud investigation. The list of properties named in the injunction was longer than Maris had expected. Marsh had apparently moved quickly in the week since the feed store to collect preliminary statements from the other Valley families, because the injunction named not just the Hale Ranch, but 6 additional properties, including Vera Haver's farm and 2 properties owned by families Maris had never directly contacted, whose names she recognized from the copies she'd distributed, and who had apparently reached out to the federal office themselves. She read the injunction 3 times. Gideon read it once, set it down, and went outside and stood on the porch for a while. She could see him through the kitchen window, standing with his hands on the porch railing, looking out at the pines and the mountain above them, and she understood without needing to see his face that this was what relief looked like on a man who'd spent 14 years building something and had come closer than he'd let himself acknowledge to losing it. She left him alone with that. It wasn't hers to interrupt. What came after the injunction was long and not dramatic in the way that the feed store had been dramatic. Federal investigations are like that. They do their work in offices and courtrooms and deposition rooms, in the language of legal documents and witness statements. And the people at the center of them often spend weeks in a kind of suspended waiting, knowing things are happening but not seeing most of it happen. Crow was served with the fraud investigation notice 9 days after the injunction. His attorney's response was aggressive and technically sophisticated, and bought him approximately 3 weeks before the weight of the evidence. And Edmund Rourke's suddenly very cooperative testimony, once it became clear that Rourke's choice was between cooperating and being the primary subject of the conspiracy charge rather than a secondary one, made the defense posture untenable. Rourke broke first. That was how Marsh described it when he came back to the ranch 6 weeks after the injunction, this time without Cole. This time with a different quality to his visit. Less investigative, more informational. Rourke had accepted an agreement to provide complete testimony against Crow in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony confirmed what Maris had inferred from the document signatures. Rourke had been approving Crow's land acquisitions through official channels while simultaneously suppressing any complaints that came through the territorial office. In exchange, he received payments that Marsh described only as substantial and that were documented in Crow's private ledgers, which had been seized before Crow could destroy them. Crow had tried to destroy them. His bookkeeper, apparently, had not been willing to participate in evidence destruction and had instead handed the ledgers to Marsh's colleague at the territorial capital and gone home. His own people, Gideon said when Marsh told them this. When someone's built an operation on threatening and extracting, Marsh said, they don't usually build the kind of loyalty that holds under pressure. Crow was formally charged 11 weeks after the injunction. The charges included freight fraud, document forgery, mail interference, and conspiracy with a territorial official. The total amount of fraudulently extracted money across all identified properties came to just under $12,000 over 8 years, a number that meant almost nothing in the abstract and meant everything specific. When you understood that it represented dozens of farm families slowly bled toward failure, properties sold under duress, livelihoods dismantled piece by piece in amounts too small to fight on any given day. The foreclosures that could be proven to result from Crow's fraudulent pricing were reviewed. Not all of them could be overturned. Some of the sales had involved other legitimate factors. Some had been completed too long ago for the legal mechanisms to reach. But 6 properties, including the Dalton farm and the Mercer parcel, were found to have been directly foreclosed as a result of artificially inflated debt created by Crow's billing practices. Those foreclosures were voided. The properties were returned. Clara Dalton came back to the valley. Maris was at the ranch when she arrived, drove up the road herself in a wagon borrowed from her sister, wearing the expression of a woman who couldn't yet trust what was happening but was going to see it through to certainty before she let herself feel it. She hugged Maris in the yard with the specific force of someone who doesn't hug easily, and meant it precisely because of that. My husband kept saying someone would look eventually, Clara said, pulling back and looking at Maris steadily. He was more optimistic than me. He was right, Maris said. He usually was. Clara looked away at the mountain, collecting herself. I thought I'd have to sell it. The house needs work. The land's been sitting, but it's mine. She looked back. It's still mine. There are moments in a person's life that you witness rather than participate in, moments that belong fully to someone else, that you're only present for, and the right thing is to stand quietly and let them have the full weight of it. Maris stood in the yard and let Clara Dalton have the full weight of what she'd gotten back. Thomas Rowan came to the ranch on a Tuesday in early winter. Maris saw him from the kitchen window first, his wagon coming up the road, slower than Crow's riders had come, tentative in a way she'd never associated with her father, who had moved through the world with the certainty of a man who'd decided early that his own judgment was sufficient. He looked smaller than she remembered. That wasn't a mean observation. It was simply true. She went outside to meet him. Gideon stayed in the barn, and she understood that he was available if she needed him and was not going to be present in a way that intruded on something that was hers. Her father climbed down from the wagon. He had his hat in his hands, which was information. I heard what happened, he said, with Crow, with the investigation. People are talking about you. He looked at his hat. They're not saying the same things they used to. I know, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The mountain wind moved between them. I don't know how to say what I came to say, he told his hat. Try plain, she said. Not hard. Just direct. He looked up. His face had something on it she hadn't seen there before. Not unfamiliar exactly, because she'd seen versions of it on other people, but unfamiliar on him. It was the look of a man who'd spent a long time certain about things and had recently become uncertain, and wasn't handling the uncertainty well, but was trying to do something with it anyway. I sold you, he said. I put you on a platform, and I sold you like you were something I owned, and you were my daughter. He stopped. His jaw worked. I've been trying to find a way to make that smaller than it is, and there's no way. It's the size it is. Maris looked at him. She'd thought about this conversation in the months since August, had imagined it various ways, had assigned her father various speeches and responses, and had written her own various responses to each of them. In all the versions she'd imagined, there was more anger in her than she felt right now, standing in the cold mountain air looking at a man who looked exactly like what he was, old, ashamed, and small in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. The anger was there. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But anger and grief live in the same house sometimes, and what she felt looking at him was both, mixed together in a way that she couldn't cleanly separate and wouldn't have known what to do with cleanly, even if she could. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, she said, because it isn't. I know. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being defined by what you did. That would give you too much power over who I am, and you've had enough of that. He absorbed that in silence. What are you doing now? She asked. With your time. He cleared his throat. Working for Gruber. Farm work. He doesn't pay much, but it's honest. He paused. I'm paying back the $20. To Gideon Hale. A few dollars a month. He didn't ask me to. It seemed right. She hadn't known that. She looked at her father and saw, past the shame and the smallness, a man making a choice in the direction of something better than he'd been, and she didn't know exactly how much credit to give that, because making a choice in the right direction after you've already done the damage isn't the same as not doing the damage. But she also knew that some people never make the choice at all. Come back in the spring, she said. We'll have coffee, and we'll see how the conversation goes. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was an open door left at a specific, careful distance, the amount of distance that felt honest rather than punishing. He seemed to understand that, or understand enough of it. He put his hat back on. He nodded once. He drove back down the mountain. She stood in the yard for a while after he was gone, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, the pines making their sound, the ranch settling around her in its ordinary afternoon way. Gideon came out of the barn. He stood a few yards away from her and waited to see if she wanted company or space. He's paying back the $20, she said. To you. I know. He paused. I wasn't going to mention it. Why not? Because it's between him and his own accounting, Gideon said. Nothing to do with me, really. She turned and looked at him. He was standing with his coat open despite the cold, the way he stood when he'd been doing hard work. And the cold felt good. And she thought about the first day she'd seen him. On a horse at the edge of the square, still and unhurried while the auction went on, asking one question that nobody else had thought to ask. She thought about the porch with the left-leaning lean, the bolt on her door, the coffee he brought at 2 a.m, the way he'd stood between her and Crow's man in the feed store without discussion, without drama, just because it was the thing to do. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything." "When you rode into Red Hollow that morning, the morning of the auction, did you know what you were going to do?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave most questions. "I knew I was going to say something. I didn't know if it would matter." "Did you think I'd come with you?" "No," he said. "I thought you'd probably go in whatever direction seemed farthest from your father." "That turned out to be your direction." "It did." Something at the corner of his mouth. "I was glad of that." She walked across the yard toward him. Not dramatically, just across the ordinary cold ground of the ranch yard, in the thin winter light. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face, which she knew now in a different way than she'd known anything before. Not perfectly, not without the gaps and silences that still existed between them, but genuinely, the way you know a place you've lived in long enough to understand its particular sounds at night, and which floorboards have give and where the light comes first in the morning. "You asked me once what I wanted," she said. "In the square. You were the first person who ever asked me that." "I remember." "I want to stay." She said it plainly, because plain was the only honest register for it. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, because this is where I want to be." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I'd like to court you, at your pace. No expectations, no—" "Gideon." "Yes?" "You've been decent to me for 4 months without asking anything back. I think we're past the formal announcement." He laughed. A real one. The kind that came out surprised. The kind she'd only heard from him a few times and liked each time more than the last. "Fair enough," he said. The winter passed in the ordinary difficult way of mountain winters. Cold that was serious about itself. Work that didn't stop because the temperature dropped. The specific cabin closeness of 2 people sharing space through months of weather that kept them indoors more than either of them preferred. They argued twice, properly. Once about the ranch accounting system, which Maris thought should be reorganized entirely, and Gideon thought was fine, as long as she knew where everything was. And once about whether to take in a family they heard about through Vera Havers, a woman with 2 children who'd lost her property in a Crow-adjacent foreclosure and had nowhere to go. Gideon's hesitation was about space and resources, not about the people themselves, which Maris understood, but her position was that the resources could be managed and the space could be figured out, and the alternative was leaving a woman and 2 children without shelter in January, and that was not something she was willing to do. The family came. They stayed through winter and into spring, and the husband, who recovered from the lung illness that had partly contributed to the financial crisis, turned out to be a better carpenter than anyone had expected and spent the spring fixing the porch and rebuilding the chicken coop properly and starting on a second small structure at the edge of the yard that grew, gradually, into something livable. Vera Havers sent 2 women from Red Hollow in the spring. Not her idea exactly. More that word had spread in the particular way of valleys where news moves on its own logic, and people who needed somewhere to land had started arriving at the mountain ranch the way people arrive at the one place that has a reputation for not turning them away. Maris hadn't planned for any of this. It had happened the way most real things happen, one situation at a time, each one making the next one possible, none of them part of a design. By spring, the ranch had 6 additional people on it and a school of sorts. Not formal, not announced as such, just Maris sitting with the children in the afternoon going through figures and letters because they needed it, and she could do it, and nobody had told her she couldn't. One afternoon in April, Gruber came up the mountain with news from town. The Crow trial had concluded. Silas Crow was convicted on 11 of the 14 charges. The 3 that didn't result in conviction involved properties where the records hadn't survived, and was sentenced to 8 years. Edmund Rourke's cooperation agreement resulted in a 3-year sentence and the permanent revocation of his territorial appointment. Crow Mountain Freight was dissolved. The freight contracts across the valley were open to competitive bidding for the first time in over a decade. Gruber told them this in the kitchen over coffee, and when he was done, he looked at Maris with the expression of a man who wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to say it. "My wife wants to know if you'd consider coming to speak at the Valley meeting in May," he said. "About what happened, what you found, how you found it. She thinks people should hear it from you." "I'm not a speaker," Maris said. "You stood in my feed store and turned it around in 20 minutes, Gruber said. "That's speaking." She looked at him. She looked at Gideon, who was watching her with the patient expression of someone who already knew what she was going to say and was waiting for her to say it. "All right," she said. She wasn't all right, not exactly. She was nervous about it, in the specific way she was still nervous about being visible in a town that had once watched her be auctioned. But nervous and willing were not mutually exclusive, and she'd learned that lesson thoroughly enough by now that it didn't require relearning. The Valley meeting in May was held in the feed store again, because the feed store was the largest covered space, and because it seemed right. She didn't give a speech. She told a story, the same story she'd been living for 9 months, from the box of receipts to the federal injunction to the forged signature to the feed store to the trial. She told it plainly. She didn't make herself heroic in it, and she didn't make it tidy because it hadn't been tidy. She included the parts where she'd been scared. She included the part where she'd doubted whether Cole would actually come through, the weeks of waiting, the 10-day clock. She included the part where her father had stood at the base of the platform and watched the bidding and done nothing. She said, "The fraud happened because it was designed to be invisible. Small amounts, slow increases, spread across people who never compared notes. The way you fight something invisible is you make it visible. You put the numbers side by side. You ask the question that nobody else is asking. You write things down even when you don't know if anyone will ever read them. Because sometimes someone will come looking, and what you wrote will be there." She said, "The most important thing Clara Dalton's husband ever did might have been keeping records he didn't know how to use and asking his wife to keep them after he was gone." She said, "Being dismissed is not the same as being wrong. Being ignored is not the same as being invisible." The people in this valley had been told, in various ways, that what was happening to them was just the way things were, that Silas Crow was too established to be questioned, that the territorial office would handle concerns appropriately. None of that was true. And the way to know it wasn't true was to look at the numbers yourself. She said, "Look at your own numbers." After the meeting, standing in the late afternoon light outside the feed store, Maris noticed for the first time that nobody in Red Hollow was looking at her the way they used to look at her. It wasn't that they were looking at her with reverence or admiration or any of the things that get written into stories about this kind of moment. It was simpler than that and more real. They were looking at her like she was a person, just a person, with her own history and her own competence and her own right to take up space in the valley, the way you look at someone you know. Not a figure, not a story, not the woman who'd been sold on that platform or the woman who'd brought down Silas Crow. Just a person named Maris who lived up on the mountain and knew figures and had, it turned out, more nerve than most. Gideon was standing by the wagon waiting for her. He'd been at the back of the room during the meeting, and she'd been aware of him there the way she was aware of him in rooms now. A specific presence, reliable, taking up exactly as much space as it actually occupied. "Well," he said when she reached him. "It was fine." "It was better than fine." "It was fine," she said again, because she'd learned that accepting things fully required giving them their actual scale, and the meeting had been important and hard, and she was glad it was over and it was fine. He handed her up into the wagon without making a moment of it. They drove back up the mountain the way they'd driven down it, through the afternoon light that was going gold in the particular way of spring evenings in the foothills. The valley spread out below them, and the pines made their sound, and the ranch waited at the top of the road the way it always waited. Solid, imperfect, leaning a little to the left on the porch, but standing, which was the main thing. Maris thought about who she'd been the last time she rode this road, coming down it for the first time behind a stranger, holding the back of his coat, not knowing whether she was riding towards something or just away from everything else, deciding that away was enough for then, and that enough for then was all you could ask of a first step. She thought about Clara Dalton's husband writing, "This is not an accident," in the margins of a billing statement, pressing so hard the words went through the paper, trusting that someone would eventually turn the page over and read what was written on the back. Someone had turned the page. She hadn't known she was going to. She'd gone looking for billing discrepancies in a neglected box of receipts and found something larger, and then found herself inside it and had made a series of choices. Not all of them confident, not all of them correct, none of them made with certainty about how they'd turn out, that had led eventually here. Here was a ranch with 6 extra people and a school that wasn't called a school, and a porch that still leaned, and a kitchen table where the lamp burned late on the nights when the work required it. Here was a valley where 11 foreclosures had been overturned and 6 families had come back to land they thought they'd lost. Here was a man driving a wagon who'd once asked one question in a crowded square and had been asking it in various forms ever since. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently, the way quiet questions persist. Here was Maris Rowan, 30 years old, ink-stained, calloused, tired in the good way of someone who'd spent her energy on something that mattered, riding home. Nobody had given her any of it. She hadn't been rescued into it. She'd walked toward it in the only direction available and kept walking when it got complicated and hadn't stopped when it got frightening because stopping and frightened felt too similar to what she'd already been, and she'd been that long enough. The wagon turned up the last stretch of road, and the ranch came into view, and from the yard she could see the lamp was already lit in the front window by whoever was home first, one of the children probably, and the light sat there against the coming dark the way lights do. Small, specific, warm, proof that someone had thought to put it there. She looked at it for a moment. Then she climbed down from the wagon and walked through the gate and went inside.